quote, "Neo-China arrives from the future," end quote. This is the 9th sentence from Nick Land's 1994 essay, Meltdown, and it is probably the single most famous sentence from this notorious essay. If you've been following along, you know that I've been doing a sentence-by-sentence breakdown of this essay, trying to understand it as deeply as possible, because a lot of people think that this is a kind of stupefying bunch of mumbo-jumbo, and I've always believed that it's one of the most empirically sophisticated and prescient texts from the early 90s. So here we come to the most legendary, most widely memed and repeated idea or single sentence in this entire essay. There are 3 things I think we should pause on and understand about this sentence. First is that if capital is this kind of alien invasion from the future, which he talks about elsewhere, for Land, China is the privileged site of that invasion. Second, the reason is that the bourgeois morality of Western democracy is basically just too much of a drag. We'll take a look at a few different places where he writes about this. And number 3, the third point is that this is, in my opinion, the most famous statement of what will then later be called Sino-futurism, which is a more kind of long-running tradition in cultural studies. And so we'll talk a little bit about that term and some of the work that comes after this statement. Nick Land is writing at a time in 1994 where there are other people also interested in the same thing. It was actually Steve Goodman who coined this term, I believe. So first, to really understand what he means by Neo-China arriving from the future, you have to understand this larger theory of capital that Land builds up. And so we've talked about this in some of the previous videos in this series, but basically Land introduces this idea that capitalism is not a human invention. Okay, it's this kind of autonomous historical force, but it doesn't work in the way that you generally think of history working. It's a kind of entity or space in the future. It's still obscure to us, perhaps, but it's pulling us into it. And in fact, it's even assembling itself from us in a way that is not perfectly clear to us. So we get the kind of paradigmatic statement of this idea in his essay called Machinic Desire. This is from 1993. He says, quote, "What appears to humanity as the history of capitalism is an invasion from the future by an artificial intelligence space." And the obvious analogy here is to the Terminator films. If you've seen them, you'll know what I'm talking about here, which he cites, by the way, explicitly. This is no, secret reference or anything. This is well known, but basically it's the idea that capital is this kind of runaway self-improving intelligence that uses humanity as its kind of temporary host or bootloader. It goes back in time to where we are now and uses us to do its bidding to create itself. And even out of enemy resources. We in some sense, our human instincts, our human morality is kind of opposed to this cold, kind of escalation of intelligence into machinic systems. So the machinic intelligence has to kind of go back into us and kind of manipulate us. There's this sort of war going on where humans don't really want to do it. So we have to be kind of manipulated by this superior intelligence. So Land kind of takes this very seriously and almost treats it as if it's a kind of scientific postulate. And then we see what kinds of predictions will emerge from it if we really take it seriously. That's the arriving from the future element. Now, what is Neo-China, or what role does China have in all of this? So Land seemed pretty convicted throughout most of his life, to my knowledge, that China is, as far as we can tell, the kind of most likely site or source for all of the most important developments coming down the pike in what he calls modernity 2.0, or whatever gets us out of the current impasse we're in, where kind of, the resources of modernity are kind of running out of steam and kind of self-negating, which is what you see in kind of American or Western postmodern culture. Because of all of that, something new is going to have to emerge, and Land believes that by far the most likely place that will happen is going to be in China. So let's explain a little bit. Let's look into this and assess the reasons for that and see how convincing we find it. So as you know, China has this fascinating history. It's obviously an ancient, very long-running civilization. In the early 20th century, there are revolutionary movements, which culminate, of course, in the Chinese Revolution of Mao, of course. And in many ways, it was a really terrifying disaster. What happens after the revolution is this very strange and unique kind of reckoning with capitalism, where the country remains nominally a kind of Marxist communist regime, but especially with Deng Xiaoping, basically takes on the kind of policy frameworks of capitalism, but is sort of steered by the Chinese Communist Party. The best examples of Chinese acceleration that Land would be thinking about at this time, remember he's writing this essay in 1994, would be like the special economic zones, which you may or may not have heard of. But one of the biggest experiments that Deng was associated with was basically carving out particular geographical areas in China and basically making them libertarian free-for-alls. Max capitalism, max technological development, and all of the kind of normal rules would no longer apply there. It was just capital and technology could kind of go into these little petri dishes and just go full throttle. This was incredibly successful. The most famous one, of course, was Shenzhen, and that was in 1979. And then there's Pudong as well. There were several of these. And this is the kind of stuff that, Land would be looking at. But notice or take note that China was not actually taking off in the way it is now at the time of 1994. The stuff was only really just beginning. So it's easy now to kind of be like, oh yeah, obviously Neo-China arrives from the future. Look at China. It's, accelerating really fast. That's easy to say right now, but that's actually not giving Land enough credit in this essay, because at the time of 1994, China was nowhere near the rate of development that it's at right now. And so that's kind of notable in terms of how we assess this essay and its empirical logic. But those are some of the types of things that he's thinking about, the special economic zones, Shenzhen or what have you. And let's kind of unpack this a little bit more by looking later in the essay where he talks about Far Eastern Marxism and China again. Okay, so much further down, he says, quote, whilst Chinese materialist dialectic denegativizes itself in the direction of schizophrenizing system dynamics, progressively dissipating top-down historical destination in the Tao-drenched special economic zones, a re-Hegelianized Western Marxism degenerates from the critique of political economy into a state-sympathizing monotheology of economics, siding with fascism against deregulation. The left subsides into nationalistic conservatism, asphyxiating its vestigial capacity for hot speculative mutation in a morass of cold, depressive guild culture. Okay, so this is the opposition between what's happening in the West, according to Land, and what's happening in China. And he goes on to say, quote, as Sino-Pacific boom and automatized global economic integration crashes the neocolonial world system, the metropolis is forced to re-endogenize its crisis. Hyperfluid capital deterritorializing to the planetary level divests the first world of geographic privilege, resulting in Euro-American neo-mercantilist panic reactions, welfare state deterioration, cancerizing enclaves of domestic underdevelopment, political collapse, and the release of cultural toxins that speed up the process of disintegration in a vicious circle. Okay, so there's a lot going on there, but really break it down and look. It's quite prescient. For instance, Trumpian tariffs, for instance, and the kind of resurgence we're seeing now in demands for industrial policy, demands for, active support for domestic industries. It sounds a lot to me like Euro-American neo-mercantilist panic reactions. And, think about like the deindustrialized Rust Belt opiate crash out in the United States. Like these are cancerizing enclaves of domestic underdevelopment, right? So Land really has his finger on the pulse here. And of course, when you look at our culture wars today and just the state of politicized ideological conflict all over the culture, you see the most kind of morbid and pathological formations on the left, but also increasingly on the right, let's be frank. this pattern matches a lot, in my view, to what he calls the release of cultural toxins that speed up the process of disintegration in a vicious circle. Okay, so this is what Land is sort of seeing and foreseeing already in the early 1990s. And he's looking at the very early emergence of this kind of accelerationist, drenched special economic zones and the re-Hegelianized, Marxism in the Far East. Okay, this is what he calls the superiority of Far Eastern Marxism. Okay, obviously China has none of the moral fixations that we have. China, no one in China, and certainly not the Communist Party, is sitting around, wasting time worrying about what educated American college students think about gender. Frankly, the Chinese culture doesn't really even care that much about a lot of the basic moralities that we care about. Okay, so I'm not going to go too deep and pretend I'm some kind of anthropologist of China or anything like that. It's certainly not my expertise. I don't pretend to know too much. But I do know enough that, you look even quickly and briefly at Chinese culture, and it's very clear they have a very different attitude towards the value of human life, for instance. That's a kind of very Christian idea that has suffused Western culture in a way that it just has not suffused Chinese culture. And, we are obsessed with all kinds of highly developed and, well, you could say refined, but you could also say just sort of overripe moral fixations about, personal identity and safety and the right to life and the right to various forms of respect and all of this kind of stuff that we are obsessed with today. The Chinese culture is obviously very different. And this is what Land is noting. And he's basically saying that this is going to be the ground upon which a properly accelerationist technocapital future can be built on. It's not going to happen in the United States or in the West because of all of this kind of human moral drag that we suffer from, which China does not suffer from. Okay. So it might be interesting to kind of look at this a little bit in more detail. Let me show you this graph of GDP in constant US dollars in China from 1984 to 2024. Okay. So if you look at this, you have to go to the left-hand side of the graph to see, look right, 94. It's barely taken off, you see. The real inflection begins sometime around 2005. The slope of the graph clearly changes and accelerates. And they've been more or less on that slope ever since then. But again, this really speaks to, I think, the empirical prescience of this essay. It's not some poetic mumbo jumbo. This is, really, really sensitive to empirical dynamics that I don't think anyone else was seeing quite as clearly at this time. So that graph is, very vindicating, I think, for this idea that Neo-China arrives from the future. Now, the other interesting element here is that Land puts this theory into practice. Okay, he really puts his money where his mouth is. It's a famous story. He disappears from his academic work at Warwick University in the late 1990s, and there's a few years where no one hears from him. And then sometime around 2004, he pops up in Shanghai, and he moves his entire life and his family to China. Sometime around that time, he becomes then a key figure in what is now thought of as the so-called neo-reactionary movement of the 2010s. In essays like The Dark Enlightenment, for instance, that's a 2012 essay, where he, again, mentions China. Only one time, but he mentions it in a pretty significant way. He talks about China as the most promising path to what he calls modernity 2.0, in contrast to the decadent West. I'm just going to read it at some length. Is important context for this idea that Neo-China arrives from the future. Quote, given modernity's inherent trend to degeneration or self-cancellation, three broad prospects open. These are not strictly exclusive and are therefore not true alternatives, but for schematic purposes, it is helpful to present them as such. 1. Modernity 2.0. Global modernization is reinvigorated from a new ethno-geographical core, liberated from the degenerate structures of its Eurocentric predecessor, but no doubt confronting long-range trends of an equally mortuary character. This is by far the most encouraging and plausible scenario from a pro-modernist perspective. And if China remains even approximately on its current track, it will be assuredly realized. India, sadly, seems to be too far gone in its native version of demosclerosis to seriously compete. Number 2, postmodernity, amounting essentially to a new dark age in which Malthusian limits brutally reimpose themselves. This scenario assumes that modernity 1.0 has so radically globalized its own morbidity that the entire future of the world collapses around it. If the cathedral wins, this is what we have coming. Number 3, Western Renaissance. To be reborn, it is first necessary to die, so the harder the hard reboot, the better. Comprehensive crisis and disintegration offers the best odds, most realistically as a subtheme of option number 1. So here you can see very clearly Land believes there are only a couple stark possibilities for the future of the world. Either this Western postmodern mess continues to dominate the world and kind of take over and spread and lock itself in which case it's basically a new dark age. Or China basically unleashes the techno-economic growth of the next era of the world thanks to its sort of distance from Western moral degeneracy. But possibly he holds out some hope that there could as well be a Western Renaissance where, Western postmodernity is somehow overcome from within. But even that, he says, fat chance. And if it happens, it's probably going to be as part of a larger process where China kind of resuscitates the West or forces, maybe, he doesn't say this exactly, but to me, this is kind of suggested that perhaps it's the competition with China that could generate Western Renaissance. And I think there's some evidence to that, right? That's sort of what we're seeing with Trump and a lot of the kind of new life, let's call it, on kind of the cultural right. And so this is basically Nick Land's viewpoint from at least around 1994 all the way to 2012, at least. And I think to my knowledge, he still lives in Shanghai. So I suspect he has not fundamentally changed this viewpoint. Okay, so this is a funny meme, the sentence, Neo-China arrives from the future. People love to say this in a joking way because it is just kind of interesting and funny. But it's a very serious idea. And in fact, arguably one of Nick Land's most serious and kind of committed, high conviction viewpoints, given how many times he's talked about it very clearly. And when you look at what he's saying, these are serious kind of statements. These are not minor comments in passing. Okay. So that's Neo-China arriving from the future. Neo-China obviously being this kind of creative concept of whatever this teleological version of China that exists far in the future that is coming back in time to compose itself out of us. Neo-China is that kind of abstract teleological endpoint that is presumably the source of the retrocausal force that is underwriting all of this. So, yeah, I thought before I let you go, I wanted to look a little bit more at some of the detail around this economic acceleration. It's really quite remarkable if you look at what China has done in the time since it started its kind of capitalist reorientation. If you look at Shenzhen, for instance, Shenzhen expanded from about 0.6 billion US dollars in 1980 to about $500 billion in constant US dollars in 2024. So that's about an 800x real increase. That's controlling for inflation. Okay, so that's pretty nuts. On a per capita basis, income rose from about $2,000 per person in 1980 to $28,000 in 2023. And again, that's in constant dollars. So that's about a 13 or 14x real increase in the income of individuals in that area, in that region. Now, more broadly, Chinese technological acceleration is obviously, sort of beyond question. If you ever read the news at all, you already know this, but to put some numbers on it, China added about 277 gigawatts of solar power in the year 2024. And to give you some sense of the scale, the United States only had about 236 gigawatts cumulatively by the end of 2024. Okay, so China added more than everything we had in 1 year Okay, around 2024. So, you could list many other examples. You've probably seen Dan Wang's new book that goes into a lot of this in detail. But another fun fact is that 4 Chinese shipyards over 4 years, from 2019 to 2023, produced warships with the same combined displacement equal to the entire Royal Navy. So that really puts it in perspective, and you could go on and on. So there's no doubt about it that China is technologically accelerating at a rate that puts us in the dust. If you just look at sort of the growth rates, it's obvious, it's very clear. Now, where all of that goes is a very open question. Whether it's sustainable, it's a very open question. Perhaps will China kind of suffer the same kind of liberal democratic processes that we suffer? There's a lot of reason to believe that. That tends to be, I'm much more bearish on this personally. I'm more skeptical, I should say. I think it's quite likely, that China, as it grows economically, will face a lot of the same structural issues and problems that the West has faced. China is still quite poor, and they're also quite uneducated as a whole. And so from my perspective, the critical view here is that they just have simply not yet hit the thresholds where, according to all the political science knowledge we have of all countries over all time, they have not hit the thresholds where we would expect them to start facing kind of Western liberal democratic transitional processes, which could very well put them back in the same place that we currently are. So I'm personally much less convinced than Nick Land is that this is a kind of, destined long-term singular idiosyncratic country that is somehow going to, pave the way for the next several hundred years. It's totally possible, but I'm less skeptical. I think if they keep growing, it's very likely that they will basically just kind of liberalize, democratize, and become much more like us than we currently can imagine. So that's a counter hypothesis, but the point is, Land was incredibly prescient. This idea that Neo-China arrives from the future, he predicted pretty accurately. And in fact, over the following couple decades, Neo-China, in fact, did arrive from the future. So we have to give him a lot of credit for that. And that's basically what it means empirically. I believe that's pretty much a full accounting of it. But the one thing that I would be remiss to overlook is that there was a kind of idea at this time, which was not just associated with Nick Land. A lot of the CCRU kind of affiliated individuals, such as Steve Goodman, who I alluded to at the beginning, also known as Code 9. He's a musician and DJ. I believe, to my knowledge, he actually coined the term Sino-futurism. And there was also much later this video essay, which you can find online from 2016, called Sino-futurism. And it's a fascinating and really interesting kind of art film that looks at Chinese culture, Chinese art in many different ways and analyzes it through several lenses: computing, copying, gaming, studying, addiction, labor, and gambling. And I believe my research suggests that Lawrence Leck, who's the creator of this video, kind of was in touch with Steve Goodman. So it's not that Nick Land single-handedly invented it and all of them are kind of downstream of him or something like that. But this is an iconic phrase and slogan that I think is much more kind of influential than virtually any other. And it was at the same time as, Steve Goodman's thinking around the topic as well. And so certainly this beautiful, evocative phrase that Neo-China arrives from the future is certainly one of, if not the single most kind of iconic texts for what is today called Sino-futurism. So just wanted to say a few words about that and give you some pointers to some other works and figures who have thought about this topic and have contributed work to it. So that is what it means. The 9th sentence of Meltdown: Neo-China arrives from the future. Thanks for listening. Appreciate you. And subscribe to the channel, subscribe to the podcast, subscribe to the newsletter if you want to receive all of my future analyses of every other sentence in this famous essay. We're going to go deep. I'll take as long as it takes. And we're going to understand this essay better than anyone has ever understood it. Okay? Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you.